Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Altmed podcast. Andrew Dowling here with me as always, my trusty co-host Mitch Kurtz.
Looking howdy.
I try. Had a shave? Actually, ostensibly, no, you haven't.
No, I haven't. Terrible eyesight.
And we are delighted. We have a very special guest with us today, the co-founder and managing director of Heyday. It is none other than Phoebe Macleod. Phoebe, welcome to the show.
Hey guys, thank you for having me.
It's our pleasure. Very glad to have you here. I know we've got a lot of areas that we furiously agree on, so I'm really looking forward.
I know it's going to be a good chat.
Exactly. So yeah, we might start just by finding out. So, how did you fall into medical cannabis? Because everyone's got their own story of how they fell into this space. What's yours?
Yeah, and it's often quite personal, and I think it is for me too. So I'm an intellectual property lawyer by training and have been working for a big medical research organisation, the Murdoch Children's Research Institute, for the last 7 years prior to going on maternity leave in early 2020 to have my second baby boy, and was very happily working away there. Loved working at a big not-for-profit medical research organisation. I was the head of legal and also co-led the business development team and spent a lot of time, protecting the IP and finding ways to commercialise the great research coming out of the institute that had an application in digital health. So we built concussion recognition tools for parents to recognise the symptoms of concussion on the sidelines of the footy field with the AFL. We used Xbox Connect to measure upper limb impairment in kids with cerebral palsy. So it was a really fun space. And I think I did a lot of, licensing and had a lot of commercial experience on top of just managing the legals there, which was big. So I managed a team of 4 lawyers. And the MCRI has a deep history in genetics research, and I did my major in genetics as part of my science law degree. So it's a great fit for me. Was not looking to move, was on a good wicket. But, life takes its turn. So 3 months into my mat leave, Jim and my mum got diagnosed with late stage pancreatic cancer. Horrible one, 7% survival rate, and mum wasn't in that 7%, but it just, floored us. But during that time, mum got diagnosed and 3 days later was starting pretty heavy chemotherapy. And during that time, my sister Thea came over from Tassie, and my brother Jim, who's a well-known sort of cannabis GP and has been in the cannabis space for sort of 4 years now, treating patients, came down and was with us for some time. And, the chemo side effects really ramped up pretty quickly. And Jim quickly got mum on a whole range of cannabis products. So mum was on a range of oils, vaporizing flower. We were making topicals, we were making edibles. And, it went from her being just unable to sort of have much quality of life to really getting her groove back in those 3 months of pretty intense chemo. So we kind of got mum back in a sense. She was sleeping and eating and, couldn't believe that she was the only person in the chemo ward putting on weight. And, I think just seeing it firsthand, Jim had obviously been banging on about it for quite a while and just, really raving about how therapeutically potent it was for a whole range of patients. At that stage, it probably treated about 700 patients already. And I'd been, just before I left work, working on the whole legal side of doing the first pediatric clinical trial of kids with epilepsy at the Royal Children's Hospital. So working with the ethics committee, experiencing all that stigma from a tertiary institution firsthand, and, which prompted me to dive into the legalities and just seeing how this medicine came to be accessible, completely reversed to a usual drug pathway. I was just kind of fascinated anyway, and then got to experience it firsthand. So, I think the cannabis really had played a great role for mum for a good period of time, and then it had run its course and it wasn't, particularly useful towards the end. And so, I think after that major life event of losing mum, who we're really close to, and faced with, what do I do with work? And we really had a lot of time talking about what Heyday could be. Like, we decided to go into product and clinic. We went into product because there was a huge lack of products available in the Australian market at the time, and we really wished we'd had access to a whole range of products that Jim just couldn't access. And I think, I was really surprised looking into it, how there was a lot of competition and a lot of people selling the same stuff, thinking this is interesting and potentially not sustainable, but our whole product philosophy is around being true to plant, and that means really getting the best of the product to every patient. And we're big advocates for the acidic cannabinoids, the minor cannabinoids. We believe in the entourage or the ensemble effect, and I think there's some really great evidence coming out around that, putting it head to head with isolates and seeing much better patient outcomes. So we wanted to dive into product development from that angle. And then on the other side of our business, we decided to integrate Jim's existing practice into a broader Heyday clinic and build up organically build up a small, sustainable little team of real healthcare experts in the field. So, GPs that have chosen to specialize in cannabis medicine. It's not something that you can you can do it on the side to a degree. And we do believe that every GP should have medicinal cannabis in their toolkit. But, building a team of really smart doctors and nurses who can look after the most chronic, complex patients. We get a lot of referrals from specialists and, find that actually it's often those chronic, complex patients that respond to cannabis the best. And that's kind of the angle with our clinic. So, started working in earnest on Heyday a good year and a bit ago now, and loving it. We've got a fantastic team and some really great other co-founders. And I think one of the things that maybe helps set us apart is that, the 4 co-founders and our cornerstone investor have sort of deep health expertise and a background in health. So our other co-founder, Sam Holt, has started several telehealth companies. He's a real health entrepreneur. He was a founder of GP2U, and then has also founded a remote dermatology business. And then our cornerstone investor, Dr. Andrew Wilson's a practicing psychiatrist. He's also the CEO of health services at Medibank. And so he kind of came down the cannabis rabbit warren with us quite deeply before he decided to get involved in the company. But having someone like him is, a credible specialist spokesperson for cannabis, really having a role to play for some of those, chronic pain, psych patients he sees that are on his list each day, and that he knows, what I have in my toolkit is not the answer. There are alternatives, and I don't necessarily want to be the psychiatrist prescribing cannabis, but I see a real role for it for this sort of patient demographic I look after, is really validating that we were on the right track.
That's great.
Yeah.
So much wisdom, actually. When we've looked at the team, I know there's just a lot of people excitedly entering the space, and we love it. But I think Heyday, you've got so much expertise in that team. So that's great to see. But yeah,
I was going to say, how'd you, this came a long way for a year and a half, but now when you talk about that, it makes a bit more sense, I think, when you put it in context. But it's all too.
Thanks. That's nice to say, Mitch. It still feels like we've got a hell of a lot to do, but
it feels like that for a lot of us.
Yeah.
But it's an all too familiar scenario, the one you described. The really heartfelt story about your mum. That's something that unfortunately we hear a lot, that type of story, and people just not having either access, knowledge, or awareness. In some situations, the finances, and then also a lot of people do end up going through the entire rigmarole of each of those sections. Learning about it, paying for it, and basically, the stigma as well. And at the end of it, they get a product that doesn't quite do the job. And knowing the full potential of this plant, it's really just disheartening and disappointing, not just for the patients, but for everybody.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And I think, there's a real need to promote true full spectrum products that that I think we believe certainly have more therapeutic power than, you know, the isolates on their own. I think, you know, it's really interesting looking at now building up the evidence base, although I, you know, believe there is a strong evidence base already, like never, I mean, just this whole role reversal of the product being made available prior to all the RCTs being done. You know, we have a wealth of observational data. Like, you know, we've got 100,000 patients, we've got use all around the world. It's got a really like amazing safety profile. So unlike other new products, there is a lot more data there to start with. And I don't think, you know, we should be discounting all that real world data, really strong observational data, and just saying, well, there aren't enough RCTs that have been done yet, because, you know, how we want to develop product and how you guys obviously like have a focus on, you know, true full spectrum products as well, is that you know, you so far from looking at just one cannabinoid, like we're hoping to get as many of the goodies in our final products as possible, but then to design, you know, a double-blind RCT around, you know, this, you know, it's so far from a single molecule drug, and then it's working on a system that, you know, has such broad sweeping effects in the body and all the things that the ECS regulates. Like having just been, you know, very involved in clinical trials over the last 10 years and, you know, working with researchers, a lot of the researchers at the MCRI got NHMRC funding to validate clinical trials that had been done by Big Pharma for different conditions in kids. And I mean, you can't replicate clinical trials. You know, you can do the same study protocol 10 times over and you get different results. So this sort of real, you know, RCT is the only valid evidence is a farce anyway, I believe. And so you know, they do need to be done, but I think it's a tricky thing to do, particularly with something like cannabis that is such a diverse medicine in itself, and it works on a system that we are, you know, still understanding how it works. So I think that will happen over time, and I think people are going to be more comfortable doing that with isolates, which is a shame because I don't believe that's as therapeutically potent as a fuller spectrum medicine. But I hope we'll get there in the end.
And you think about the fitting the single molecule in a clinical trial context just is so much easier. The more different cannabinoids that form part of a test medicine, the more variability you might have. But it's almost like we're sort of applying this older framework and you know, trying to put plant medicine into it, and it's not really the cleanest fit, really, is it? No,
and I think, I mean, I've had a lot of exposure to this because when we were doing digital health projects at my old work, we, you know, we did get a couple of our, you know, tablet app. We built a tablet app for psychologists to assess social skills in kids, and it was really relevant for kids with ASD. And we went down the path and we got that registered as a medical device. And, you know, when you're looking at doing trials to validate registrations, you know, how digital interventions work, like you get the data a lot quicker, you can get feedback quicker. And we worked with the researchers to kind of mold what, you know, a standard single molecule drug RCT could look like in a much faster digital intervention, and how we can still kind of hold it to the same standard. It was a really interesting process because there's so many like set expectations around like how an RCT has to look and feel and smell, and so just challenging that like really, you know, deep sort of set in stone understanding of what like real true evidence is super interesting. But I think it is a changing, certainly like the whole clinical trial center at the Murdoch Children's talks a lot about doing like real world trials, because it's also incredibly expensive to do those more old-fashioned RCTs.
Absolutely. It's actually,
and while you wait, in the usual case, patients are not getting access, you know, so you're on this like 8-year journey to build the evidence. And so I think that's, you know, really fortunate that cannabis is this anomaly that has become like widely available and is becoming more available as the bottleneck of doctors is expanding and more doctors feel comfortable bringing it into their remit of practice. But I'd feel, really uncomfortable if it wasn't available right now, because it does have a role to play.
Yeah, and it's interesting too that I think the tide is turning and has for a while now, with more and more doctors giving up the stigma and sort of at least even maybe hearing from colleagues about the success that they might have had in their clinical practice treating patients. But there are still a few doctors who sometimes get a bit of a platform in the news and the media to really tell us how, these products shouldn't be trusted because they haven't gone through all the randomized controlled trial benchmarks. And do roll my eyes because we just hear from that many people, to varying degrees, but there's clearly anecdotal evidence available that supports people at least considering it for clinical practice.
Yeah, and really well-designed observational studies, which, if you were just trying to rely on one or two observational studies with an N of a couple of hundred patients, fair enough, but there's a lot. Yeah, and then there's like the 100,000 plus people in Australia, using it, legally through a prescription from their GP who's monitoring them and keeping them on it because it's working. So, I just think it's just so, I almost think, in a way, because it was made legal through patient advocacy largely, I feel like that's actually in a way heightened the stigma, because what we know is we've got 10 to 15% of people going to see a GP asking about cannabis. So the doctor's already, being challenged to consider it. And we've got, really loud advocates, which is good and sometimes a little bit overwhelming. And yeah, it's just a real red herring in terms of just how, a Schedule 8 medicine would naturally come into the hands of a doctor to be prescribed. It's complete role reversal. And I think that's really challenging for everyone to wrap their heads around.
But you've got the whole, I don't know, just looking at your background, working at one of the, biggest IP boutique law firms in the country. Well, I don't know if I'd call them boutique. They're pretty big.
They were a bit more boutiquey when I was there.
But you've kind of, I guess your knowledge base comes from, understanding how intellectual property in this space can be, commercialized, but then also understanding all the regulatory hurdles that patients have to get through. Do you think we're moving in the right direction? Do you think patients have a much better chance now and are, going to have a better chance in future than what it was like when your mum, say, needed access for her palliative care?
Yeah. The number of authorised prescribers, I think some key regulatory changes by the TGA last year is reducing the administrative burden on doctors to be able to prescribe. And I think that's just, I can't overstate how key that is. You look at the traditional GP clinic, bulk billing clinic, 7-minute consults. A doctor can't even do the paperwork for one patient for a cannabis script in that time. So until we put it on a somewhat level playing field to just other prescription medicines, it's always going to be considered a specialist area, for want of a better word. And I think there's still a real need for the specialist cannabis clinics because, the endocannabinoid system and plant medicines is not on the curricula for GPs in training. I think we're a long way off it being on the curricula, which is really sad. And so a lot of doctors getting into it are doing sort of self-directed education and speaking to colleagues who might be touching it a bit more. And I just feel like in the last 4 months, there's been a bit of the tide is coming. And I think that's really exciting. Certainly we spend a lot of our time under the helm of Jim as head of the clinic, who's, got a lot of obviously experience prescribing, but is passionate and, incredibly, I hate to say it as my brother, but incredibly smart and just really passionate about the plant. And he's, a great educator. Our head nurse, Cam Rosin's just a wonderful young man who's also just a great educator. And And so we really want to play a role in educating others to feel comfortable to bring it into their sphere of practice. I mean, it's been really interesting. Just maybe the last month and a half, we've interviewed 5 GPs to come and join our clinic, and it's all being instigated by them. There's a lot of, I think there's a lot of burnt out GPs from COVID who have spoken to colleagues or who have started, doing their own research into plant medicines, and a lot of people doing sort of lifestyle integrative GP training now, I think in a way that they just weren't maybe 5 years ago. And so, a lot of the feedback's been, I really want to start playing in a space with my medical career that's, I don't want to say like helping people, because, I'm not saying what they do doesn't help, but in a more preventative sense, and just getting really meaningful patient outcomes. And I think a lot of doctors are craving that, really being able to make an impact on someone's health. As earlier on in the piece. And, doctors, like, that's what they signed up for. So I think if you get stuck in a, reactive hospital setting, like a lot of there's some dissatisfaction there. And I think there's a real opportunity to bring some great doctors across into being sort of cannabis experts. And we're excited to do that and kind of put in the time to induct and train, these new GPs properly into the complexities of cannabis medicine. Because I think we certainly believe at our clinic that it's really not just about access. Doctor-led care every step of the way through that treatment journey is really key to getting a good result. It does not end at the script. We have nurses that support along the way and check-ins with the doctor, because so much of the magic is done at that 4 or 5 week review appointment where you tweak, you might change a few things, you really understand, like the dosage regime's just so personal. It has to be so personalized. It's amazing that one person with the same medical condition can respond to, 0.2, 0.4 mil, and then the other needs far more to get the same results or a completely different product. It is a complex field of medicine. And I think any doctors entering the space should be doing that under the mentorship of an experienced doctor that can give them the time to understand all those little nuances.
So how do you actually navigate that with a doctor? And to tie in kind of some of the stuff we've talked about already, how do you, when you think about, we go back to the randomized control trials from before, in traditional trials, you'll try and isolate the molecule that has the effect. So, like paracetamol, for example. But in cannabis, there's so many compounds. It's some might argue that's why it's been so difficult to actually draw, the same conclusion each time, because each time you get a different strain, you get a different effect. One makes you sleepy, one makes you alert, these kinds of things. How do you navigate that for a doctor who's just kind of a little bit, let's say green to it all, and is looking to say, well, like, what do I just? Is cannabis? Obviously, we know that there's different forms. How do you take on a new doctor and really describe that to them?
Yeah, well, I think, at the moment in Haddock Clinic, we've got 2 great doctors, Jim and Dr. Priya Ayer, was an experienced cannabis doctor in her own right. And so I think we're still working up all our induction material that will train up these new GPs to understand the complexity. I think a lot of it will be learned. We certainly are not a prescriptive clinic. We don't say to our doctors, these are the only medicines you can prescribe. We're very cognizant of the fact that we're a product and a clinic company, and really frown down upon the clinics that only push their product. I just think that's just such a inherent conflict of interest that should be transparently and openly managed. So happy to talk about that at any time. But, I think a lot of it is those new doctors shadowing our experienced GPs and just working through the different case studies, understanding so our doctors have a fortnightly clinical roundtable where the difficult cases are discussed, treatment options are thrown around. It is a process of trial and error, which is why coming back for your review appointments, tweaking, recommending additional supplements. Like we recommend lots of, compounded magnesium and PEA, and there's some great things that can be synergistically working alongside the cannabis. So yeah, great question, Mitch. We haven't got the golden rule book that we can give to each new GP. I wish that existed in cannabis. I just don't think it does. And we certainly encourage our doctors to be up to date with all the latest products coming out, because having a vast range of products to pick from for each patient, that's very different. Important.
It's also like just looking at the quantum leaps in knowledge, even from the last 10 years. I assume that's also part of the appeal for doctors who might be feeling a bit, burnt out, vaped out. I don't know how to describe them, but they're just getting to the end of this last 2 years and thinking, maybe I've gone through med school, maybe I've, to some extent, I've kind of been institutionally captured, and I'm, been sort of boxed in, and this is what I will do for the next 40 years. And
the pennies dropped a bit more because we've had the challenges of COVID disrupting the normal. And I think it's made telehealth really appealing. That's become such a mainstay. I mean, COVID has just catapulted telehealth 20 years into the future of where it would have otherwise been. And that's a really positive outcome of COVID. But I think too, doctors are really, certainly the ones we've been talking to, are certainly assessing the system in that, how can I actually get a great patient outcome in a 7 to 10 minute consult? How can you even really get to know anyone in that time? So we do sort of 30-minute initial consults, which is still not long enough for a lot of the chronic complex patients we do see. But I think if you can, find a way to financially run a clinic that can offer that really deep level of care from the outset, you're putting yourself in a much better position to get the patient a good result than maybe a bit of a tick and flick type model.
Yeah, absolutely.
Which is more band-aidy rather than getting to the root cause and trying to find a personalized treatment regime that really works for them.
Well, I'm going to throw a curveball at you, because one of the, and I don't know if it's in the purview of Heyday, but in terms of getting to root cause of people's problems in the mental health arena, we know about the evolving field of psychedelic medicines. And, being Altmed, we've got time for all alternative medicine. And I guess, that's another field that you talked earlier about doctors who, there's this kind of renewed interest in integrative health and actually, being a little bit more involved in a patient's recovery journey from a given condition. What's your sort of take on that field? Is that something that you guys, is cannabis going to be the gateway drug for Heyday?
Good question. We've certainly been following what's happening with the psychedelics and psilocybin and I guess MDMA, but, psilocybin in particular, we've got a shrink in the team who's, very keen to see how it progresses. He certainly doesn't believe that mushies are going to get sent out in the mail anytime soon like cannabis does, that really it's much more of an assisted therapeutic tool, but certainly has a place. I think, I've listened to a few interesting podcasts where cannabis experts have talked then about, the range of opportunities that something like mushrooms presents that's even, less well understood than cannabis. And I think it's really exciting to be working with these highly complex natural products. So listen, we haven't got any plans to go into psilocybin anytime soon. I think we'll be watching with interest, and that's probably I do believe it's a valid area to exploring therapies in.
It is interesting, being in the industry and thinking about, how the split between the kind of altruistic side of medicinal cannabis or psychedelics, but we'll talk more on the cannabis side for this one, versus, some, and you hear this from patients all the time, especially on forums and the rest, feeling like the current system is extortionist in terms of, it's very expensive for the average person. It's not accessible, and reconciling that with the actual cost of doing business within the industry, speaking to yourself, how do you deal with the fact that some people view cannabis as a get rich quick scheme, for example?
Yeah, it's super interesting to see the diversity of like backgrounds from people that have come in and are playing in the product or clinic space or both. And some of the crazy money that's been raised, and following some of those companies that have done crowdfunding campaigns that have closed out a couple of $1 million raise in hours is, obviously there's people seeing an opportunity to capitalize on the hype around cannabis. I think, much like you guys, we haven't gone and raised lofty amounts of money. Like we believe that we want to grow sort of organically as the industry matures. There aren't millions of people there to sell product to, and there's certainly like a healthy amount of competition. So offering something different, in both like a clinic setting and a product setting is really important for longevity right now, I believe. But, I think, if our regulators were a little bit more proactive, would probably sort through the weeds a little bit quicker, but I think just naturally as the industry matures, the people that are in it for the right reasons and have built like a solid foundation for their business will still be swimming, but I think organically growing as the demand is there, like thoughtfully putting out products that actually work and have data and evidence behind them, and that are, as you say, like financially acceptable for patients. Like the cost is obviously massive. I think it's only a matter of time until we have more products registered, and then we're looking at PBS reimbursement, which is going to be so important to bring it into the mainstream. And it's important we like go through those steps as an industry. But all the challenges presented by developing the right sort of data set from a trials perspective to get those registrations is going to be challenging, and we might see products that we, and I think you guys believe, are probably less therapeutically active. There's some of the first being registered because they are isolates, and it's been a bit easier to build a clinical trial phase 1, 2, 3 study around.
Well, it brings to light this kind of concept which we've kind of tapped on the edges of in the podcast, which is this concept of quality and what determines quality. And the traditional view is, sterility, especially in medical markets, which absolutely sterility is important, especially if you're going to have, immunocompromised people taking it, whatever types of patients taking medicine. You always want it to be as sterile as possible and meet the standards. However, we've held the view as well that there's more to this particular plant than just sterility, and that in some isolated cases, that process of sterility can actually compromise some of the active compounds in the cannabis itself. What's your take on that kind of viewpoint?
Yeah, so that's a really good observation, and I think in Australia we are very conscious of things like sterility in particular, but I think it's troublesome that the requirements around sterility, irradiating all products, and just the current manufacturing extraction techniques available to us, the main ones being CO2 and ethanol. Like really, I think we need to start using more like extraction technologies that is more sympathetic to the plant, because in those two mainstream extraction processes, the plant, essentially gets blown to smithereens, and a lot of the goodness is lost, and a lot of the compounds that you guys and us really believe are sort of important to getting the most valid therapeutic outcome are lost. And so I think there's a real balance there that's needed, but I think probably it hasn't been challenged that much to this point, because most cannabis companies are really just laser focused on the CBD and THC content of their products. And I think, as the industry matures, then I hope that we will employ more sort of use more innovative extraction techniques to sort of sympathetically get the cannabinoids out of the plant, so they're more complex and full spectrum, because we do believe that the patient outcomes are better on those kinds of products. So the best of the plant in every bottle is ideal. And I mean, certainly at Heyday we have a large focus at the moment as we work on our R&D side of bringing out a new product range that is true full spectrum, and that's in the works on flower, because it is what can be more true to plant in a way than the flower itself. Obviously, like in a vaporizer, depending on how high you heat it to, like there are terpenes and other compounds lost, but I think flower at the moment is a great way to get a more full spectrum product than a lot of the oils currently available.
Yeah, and then the flower, you have these like gamma irradiation processes, because the threshold for microbial load for a given plant is quite low in Australia compared to other jurisdictions. Right. And so
we've actually worked with our grow partner to do pre and post irradiation COAs on some of our flowers to understand exactly what is lost, and it wasn't as bad as we thought it could be. So
that's good.
I mean, it's a tough plant in a lot of ways, isn't it?
Yeah.
But I think certainly, we're working with ECS Botanics who grow our products, and they're growing sort of exclusive strains for us right now. But as we get to feed into the grow and harvest process, and dictate just even some of the simple steps that can be taken in curing, and some of the more quirky ones to preserve some of those more unstable cannabinoids, and particularly keep the acidic versions of CBD, THC intact, is something we're really keen to just continue to persevere at, because I think what comes out at the other end is a much more full-bodied complex medicine.
Yeah, absolutely. I just curious about so in terms of, you were saying before, those clinics that do offer their own products, I agree there is a conflict there. So at Heyday, just for any prospective patients out there, they know that the doctors are agnostic with respect to, they're just really interested in finding the best quality product for patients, which might be, have a rich cannabinoid, terpenoid, flavonoid profile. Is that sort of where you guys see yourself positioned?
Yeah, absolutely. Like the clinic, is symbiotic to our product business, but they're independent businesses in their own right, and they should be. Like, they both need to wipe their own face, for want of a better word.
Yeah.
And certainly, like, we believe to attract the best doctors that have really engaged and are wanting to practice the complexity of cannabis medicine, to then dictate what products they can prescribe is sort of very counterintuitive to that. Because also Jim's obviously the head of our clinic and is involved in the product company, we make it very transparent to patients that if they don't feel comfortable about that, they can just say no Heyday products, or they can see the other doctor, or, I think it's just, we've got to own these conflicts, and, more so because there's lots of them there that aren't being managed appropriately, and there's not that much transparency with patients. So, we have had lots of patients coming from other clinics who have had one thing pushed at them, and that's got suboptimal results for them. And that's just, these are people that have been on a, diagnostic odyssey with really complex conditions, that have, found someone that they think would work. And then it's again been a disappointment with the healthcare system. So we really hope to change that for patients.
I have a question, and it's perfect to ask this question in the presence of two lawyers. But speaking about you mentioned it earlier, the stigma around cannabis. Now, how do you see that at Heyday? Because I can imagine both of you going through the corporate realms of law would have, if people knew you were chuffing on the grass or something like that, you know what I mean? That kind of ethos. How do you think it would have been received? Well, let's say back when you were a lawyer at the firm, Phoebe, and how do you think it is now? And do you think we're going towards a place where people are going to feel more comfortable with cannabis in general, medicinally or otherwise?
Yeah, I hope so. So, I mean, like you sort of mean if I was at my law firm 10 years ago and was talking to my employer about having been prescribed, how they might manage that.
Like, how do you think, is it something that, say, a professional, maybe somebody who is suffering from a condition that would be dealt with well by cannabis, but is in a position like one of you guys, for example, have been in at a law firm, which is generally more conservative.
Yeah.
Do you think there's room to, be able to be open about the fact that you're receiving cannabis therapies in that kind of world?
Oh, good question. I mean, I think it's so dependent on the culture in your workplace. There can be really progressive HR teams at what you would imagine to be pretty clunky old organizations, and then the role reversal. Like, I guess I've sort of thought about how would we be dealing with it at my research organization if I was still there advising the head of HR around the legalities. I'm glad I'm not there having that conversation, to be honest, in a way. But listen, I think it's really interesting, certainly just telling my story about what I do now to anyone that you might meet. Everyone has had some touch point with cannabis. There's been a friend of a friend, or I think it's just got to the point where, people's understanding of it being used medicinally in some way is like at the same level to, all those old memories of, whether it's the law partner or the doctor, in their 20s going to a party and smoking a bit too much and thinking, well, how can that thing that gave me that, terrible feeling the next day ever be used as a medicine? I think that's kind of fading as we just hear and we see in the media, and people are a lot more exposed to the medicinal properties of cannabis, and I think that only just builds and gets legitimized over time as more and more doctors offer it to patients. Certainly I know locally where I live in Trentham in Victoria, which is our little heyday headquarters, there's a great local GP looking after 30 patients in our little town alone. And I think, it's probably like being destigmatized at the community level, which should feed into the workplaces, but the workplaces will probably be the last to definitively sort of call it one way or the other. And I think, like, I understand the reservation there a little bit, because there are a lot of people, using cannabis sort of for quasi-medical, quasi-recreational purposes, or fully recreational. I think there's, some legitimacy around that, but there's certainly lots of people that are abusing it, and, to just blanketly agree with that as an employer is fundamentally a tricky thing to do. So I think everything on a case-by-case basis, I hope that employers are more and more open to having that conversation and understanding, like, the genesis of why an employee might be on cannabis, and if they're doing it under the guidance of a GP, a trusted GP. Like, I don't think that should be an issue unless it's really affecting their ability to work. But it's just so interesting because, people aren't called out if they're on a whole range of other, prescription medicines with all sorts of side effect profiles, in a way that cannabis doesn't impact you. So I just, everything from the driving laws and, the fact that the Drive Change campaign has to exist because, people can drive around off their face on opioids, but they can't use a little bit of, balanced oil for their anxiety. It's mind blowing.
It's a double standard. I'm kind of curious, Phoebe, if your recollections of working in private practice, and thank goodness we got out. But it wasn't too uncommon on a Friday afternoon to have a drink at your desk and maybe at some point in the not too distant future, people might be having a Friday afternoon vape. But I also wonder whether or
I
not
think that would be probably a pretty healthy, balanced thing to do.
I agree.
Yeah, I was going to pull you up earlier when you said, doctors that maybe smoked something earlier and they thought, how did I wake up the next day feeling like that? And I'm thinking, what's the next day? What feels like that the next day? Are you talking about?
Well, I think it's interesting. I think I just feel like there's a lot of doctors that have had a joint in med school and have
sure.
That's their only experience with cannabis, but it's still
it must have been the hangover from all the Tim Tams they ate or something like that.
The other thing, I guess, other side of just thinking about your question, Mitch, was just the fact as well that 10 years ago in private practice, there was no such thing as being able to have medicinal cannabis clients. And so that whole landscape's changed. So I just sort of thinking 10 years ago, if you'd sat with your graduate cohort, Phoebe, and told them all, in 10 years time, I'm going to be running this medical cannabis clinic, they'd all just be thinking, really? Is that
what's she smoking?
Yeah, what's she on? But and I assume your old firm, and I know mine, my old firm does, but they're interested in this space because they see plenty of opportunities to help clients with commercial ventures. So it's the landscape's changing. I'd be surprised almost if they weren't exploring opportunities to help clients who are in the even newer foray of psychedelic medicine. So
absolutely, yeah, there's certainly opportunity there. I mean, I think I read the MTP Connect report on the industry. I think it was commissioned, done in part by Deloitte, but it was really very factual and just interesting sort of a forensic kind of accountant team, I guess, projecting where the Australian industry is going. And I think, you'd imagine that report to be relatively conservative, but the projections are still sort of, in 5 years, 5 to 8 years, we might be looking at 800,000 medicinal cannabis patients, active patients in Australia. And it was just a reminder that we're just still so on the precipice. It's such early days, the tip of the iceberg. And I think people in the industry, with a view to be in it for the long term, are sort of excited by where it will go, and it will take time and it will take effort and it will take education of the whole medical fraternity and breaking down that stigma by ensuring good people are in the industry presenting the right face of cannabis, which I think is not necessarily being done as well as it could be being done. Yeah. And we have, that really beautiful complexity of the plant amongst all these product companies. So it's not just, it's all the same, and no one knows really how to differentiate them because there isn't much difference. The doctors are all confused because what are the differentiating factors? So I think we are genuinely excited about where it's headed. And I think as more and more patient numbers grow, we'll see that stigma come down. We'll see acceptance from doctors. The research is happening right now. There's some great studies. There's more, every week really. It's highly researched, and it needs to be. There's over 100 conditions that the TGA have approved it for. So I think just how diverse it is in the diseases that it can be useful, because what cannabis is, it's a side effect management tool. And it works really well for chronic pain, and that's just a side effect of so many core conditions. So building the evidence base to prove its utility and what the appropriate dosage forms are and what cannabinoids might work best for certain indications, it's going to take a long time. But I think we're lucky that it's available to patients right now, and I hope that in the process to get all these various products approved for various clinical indications, where we're looking at the real world data, we're capturing the data from all the patients, legally accessing it right now, and getting good patient outcomes, that is valid, and needs to be fed into the clunky old process to get to ARTG listing. But I think any cannabis company in the field that's not sort of, thinking and understanding that, in 8-10 years, we are going to have a whole range of cannabis medicines on the ARTG, and that the SAS, unapproved medicines scheme that's currently available will whittle down as that happens. There's a need to invest in sort of validating your product and building that data. And, if only you could do a clinical trial and have it approved for a whole range of conditions, wouldn't that be good? But hopefully there's some leveraging of the existing data out there to make that happen a bit quicker.
Yeah, exactly. If it's helpful for, I don't know, for anxiety, then it should be valid evidence perhaps to maybe use in a sleep trial. I'm not sure, but no, it's and I think the first product that'll probably get on the ARTG is going to, easiest pathway would be an isolate. So I still feel like there's going to be a lot of people kind of saying, oh yeah, okay, you can get an isolate over the counter, but if you want a really good true full spectrum, to use that term, then you're going to need to go and see an authorized prescriber for the time being. But
and I just hope that when there's a couple of isolates listed, that the whole SAS AP scheme isn't shut down,
exactly.
Because there will be really great medicines there that patients are reliant on, that where the evidence is being built. It'd be really interesting to see it play out. I think one of the things that keeps me really engaged with working in this space and kind of realizing that I'm very have veered a long way from the path that I thought I was on, is it's just really interesting. There's so many quirks to being in this unique field of health. There's so many benefits, there's so many challenges, from the regulatory to the access. It's just
I was going to say,
it's really
you
fun.
and I are one of the few, or two of the few that know the rule book. So lucky us. No disrespect, Mitch. I've taught you a few things along the way. You've taught me some things.
I mean, it's sort of crazy to me how many cannabis companies there are who aren't from health, who don't necessarily have some legal regs expertise. It can be learnt to a point, but it's very heavy on the reg side. There's a lot to be understood. There's obviously a lot of companies that don't understand the TGA advertising guidelines, or are just flagrantly breaching them.
Andrew started developing mouse calluses just around here, so it's been heavy on the clicking.
Very, very funny. Well, on that note, thank you, Mitch. But Phoebe, it's been such a pleasure talking to you. We're really you talked about there are definitely those who are in it for the long haul to see the cannabis industry in Australia be the best it can be. We know you're a part of that. We like to think of ourselves as part of that. So we have no doubt we will continue to cross paths. We might even get you on for another episode if we can talk you into it at some point in the future. But
love to, anytime.
Yeah, no, thank you. And it's best of luck with everything at Heyday. We're obviously super interested in everything that very knowledgeable clinic is doing. So big supporters, and we look forward to speaking again soon, and all the very best.
Absolutely.
Thanks, guys.
And we'll be getting Jim on for sure.
You've got to interview the rest of the team.
100%.
Absolutely.
Awesome.
Look forward to connecting again soon.
Indeed.
Absolutely. It's been a pleasure. Thank you so much.
All right, guys. Have a good night.